The Bush family has had a number of documented business relationships or investments that overlapped with the bin Ladens. George H.W. Bush, the President of the United States between 1988 and 1992, was a promoting partner or principal of a private investment firm called the Carlyle Group that solicited investments from the bin Laden family and won those investments to the multi-million-dollar scale. But these were like hedge fund investments. So you essentially put your money into a fund and you expected the Carlyle Group to reward you with a return. But in the course of soliciting and sort of managing those investments, the Bush family had direct contact with the bin Laden family during the 1990s. And James Baker, who was George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State, also seems to have represented the bin Laden family in the 1990s at the time when Bucker's branch of the family was trying to decide how to manage its interests in the United States as Osama went off the reservation. And in particular, they were being requested by the FBI and the U.S. Embassy and the Central Intelligence Agency for cooperation in the emerging effort to get at Osama. And the family seems to have provided some cooperation, but as you'll see in the book, which I hope you'll read, there remained disputes among those involved about how cooperative the family really was. And in particular, some of the FBI agents involved in the investigation and the CIA officers involved in the investigation blame the lawyers that the bin Ladens acquired for sort of thwarting their efforts to get a fuller understanding of what they were dealing with. And Baker seems to have been one of the lawyers that the bin Ladens consulted in this time for advice. And they were concerned, for instance, about Treasury Department sanctions that might freeze the family's money as a way to either punish Osama or because there had been some fact-finding of family culpability. And these were the kinds of things that they kind of lawyered up to deal with as 9/11 approached.
And they stood to lose a lot of money should their assets be frozen.
Yes, and they started to unwind their U.S. holdings almost at the moment that Osama started to emerge as a potential threat. And by the time 9/11 came, they really didn't own the kind of, I mean, look, their U.S. investments, while extensive and in some cases entertaining, were never a very great share of their fortune. But that which they did have here, they pulled out, excepting the Carlyle Group, which they continued to have an investment in. In fact, Osama's half-brother Shafiq was in the Ritz-Carlton in Washington, D.C. on the morning of 9/11 when the planes went into the Pentagon, and he was at an investors conference for Carlyle. And one of the fascinating things about the birth records is that, remember that cluster of sons that I referred to all being born around the same time? Well, Shafiq seems to have been born within weeks of Osama in 1958. They were both singleton sons. So on, that many years later, one of them's in the Ritz-Carlton and the other one's sending a plane into Washington.
Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden had a vision. While he was young and living in near poverty while working as a porter in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, he wanted to start his own company, which would help to rebuild the kingdom into the pinnacle of the Arab world. By 1931, under the blessings of the kingdom's founder, Abdulaziz bin Al Saud, the Saudi BinLaden Group had begun. Ibn Saud gave Muhammad lucrative contracts in the kingdom, including refurbishing the mosques at Mecca and Medina and recladding the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. The family-owned business would grow extensively over the years around the Gulf, but in 1967, Mohammed bin Laden was killed when his company airplane crashed during landing in Asir province, southwest Saudi Arabia. The business would continue to be run by his oldest sons, who co-opted the company. One of those sons would later turn out to be a nefarious figure in the future, Osama bin Laden. 1979, however, a startup oil company named Arbusto Energy began raising funds for oil exploration through private offerings. The company was run by a young Texan who had connections in the oil industry, George W. Bush. James R. Bath was a Texas millionaire investor and businessman and close friends with the Bush family, one that went back many years. He was one of the company's very first investors through his father, George H.W. Bush. However, the company was in desperate need for future prospects overseas in order to compete in the open market. Bath was a representative also for the Saudi businessman Salem bin Laden, the oldest son of Mohammed bin Laden. It was here, through James Bath, that the Saudi BinLaden Group began funding Bush's company with the blessing of Salim bin Laden. Through his acquaintance, Bath eventually became bin Laden's business representative in the United States, representing him in a number of business deals, including real estate, aircraft services, and banking. In 1999, Enron announced an agreement to build a $140 million power plant in the Gaza Strip between Israel and Egypt. One of the major financiers for the project was the Saudi BinLaden Group. Construction was virtually halted in late 2000 when violence flared and the project was canceled due to Enron's scandal, which forced its closing. Over the years, the Bush family and the bin Laden family became inextricably aligned. Meanwhile, two of the more prominent Saudis, Khalid bin Mahfouz and Salem bin Laden, began investing in the infamous Bank of Credit and Commerce International, also known as BCCI, which was founded under Agha Hassan Abedi, a Pakistani who had connections throughout the business and criminal world. The BCCI Bank would later come under intense investigation due to dealings with some of the world's most notorious individuals and groups, which included Abu Nidal, Manuel Noriega, and the Medellin cartel. The bank would, however, be forced to close its business after the British government set up an independent inquiry which found large-scale massive corruption and financial ties to nefarious agencies, including the CIA and Pakistan ISI, along with illegal transactions, which left the bank in debt. Also found out was the Bush family, through his father, H.W. Bush, then the director of the CIA, had a number of accounts under false names. The relationship even extended to Bush associates. Frank C. Carlucci, the former Secretary of Defense under Ronald Reagan, had begun visiting the bin Laden family in Jeddah. Trips to the bin Laden family's compound made by the notable U.S. officials such as George W. Bush and James A. Baker, the White House Chief of Staff and U.S. Secretary of Treasury under Reagan, led many to believe the Bush-bin Laden alignment would become the de facto force in the region for the foreseeable future. It was here that Carlucci would finalize a deal with the bin Laden family to start investing with the Carlyle Group, in which he served as its chairman in hopes of having many of the prominent Saudi billionaires to start investments. The bin Laden family financial relationship with Carlyle began in 1994. At that time, they committed $2 million to a buyout fund through Carlyle Partners II, a tiny fraction of the $1.3 billion raised for the fund. Much of that money was then invested in the fund gradually over many years. The Carlyle Group is an American multinational private equity corporation which has 31 offices across 6 continents. After Carlucci's meeting in Jeddah, Prince Walid bin Talal, a Saudi billionaire and philanthropist, began heavily investing in the company. Reports later on confirmed that the bin Laden family had invested $2 million in Carlyle's $1.3 billion fund. In 1995, Carlyle and Carlucci would also hold a position with the neoconservative think tank, the Project for the New American Century. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the black sheep of the bin Laden family was immediately fingered as the primary culprit behind the attacks. But 5 years prior to the attacks, the bin Laden family had publicly announced that Osama bin Laden was hereby forever castigized from the Saudi bin Laden Group, no longer having any type of holdings or profits from the group. This put enormous pressure on the bin Laden family, who some had residency and financial dealings inside the United States going back many years. On September 14, 2001, U.S. Saudi Ambassador Prince Pandar bin Sultan, close friends with the Bush family, had visited the U.S. president, longtime bin Laden family friend George W. Bush. In the ensuing days, Saudi Arabia supervised the urgent evacuation of 24 members of bin Laden's extended family from the United States. In October of 2001, the bin Laden family would liquidate all financial holdings with the Carlyle Group. After meeting with chief executive officers of the firm, it was under mutual agreement that the bin Ladens would finalize their ties under the wake of the attacks to alleviate any scrutiny between the two families. The Saudi BinLaden Group continues to prosper today, although in recent months it has transferred 36% of their company's stocks in the Istima Holding Company, which is owned by the Saudi Ministry of Defense.